The summer of 1942 marked a turning point in the Second World War. Hitler's armies, once unstoppable, now faced a war of attrition stretching across the vastness of the Soviet Union. Fuel shortages, overextended supply lines, and a stubborn enemy slowed the German advance. Yet one objective remained fixed in Hitler's mind: Stalingrad. The city was more than a name on a map. It carried symbolic weight, bearing Stalin's name, standing as an industrial artery on the Volga River, and serving as a gateway to the oil fields of the Caucasus. Capturing it would cripple Soviet logistics and deal a psychological blow that Hitler believed could shatter Soviet morale. In August 1942, the Luftwaffe turned the city into rubble. Entire neighborhoods vanished under relentless bombing. Wooden houses burned like tinder, factories collapsed, and civilians fled toward the Volga under fire. Those who survived described the sky as permanently black, choked with smoke and ash. Stalingrad was no longer a city, it was a graveyard in the making. German 6th Army, commanded by General Friedrich Paulus, advanced confidently. Veterans of Blitzkrieg believed the city would fall quickly. But what they found was something no doctrine had prepared them for: a battlefield where every room, every staircase, every pile of bricks became a killing zone. Soviet defenders adopted a brutal doctrine known as hugging the enemy. They fought at point-blank range to negate German air power and artillery. Snipers ruled the ruins. One shot could mean death. One careless step could trigger an ambush. Day and night lost meaning amid constant gunfire. Factories like the Red October, the Barricade, and the Tractor Factory became fortresses. Machines still warm from production lines were used as cover. Workers turned soldiers fought where they had once labored. The city refused to die. Civilians who remained hid in basements without food, water, or medicine. Children carried ammunition. Women dug trenches. The Volga River, under constant shelling, became the only lifeline. Boats crossed at night, bringing reinforcements in and evacuating the wounded. Many never made it across. By September, casualties mounted at an unimaginable scale. German units captured a building during the day only to lose it at night. Streets changed hands dozens of times. A single apartment block could consume hundreds of lives. Paulus pressed forward, unaware that time itself was becoming his enemy. Each step deeper into the city tightened the trap. Soviet commanders, especially General Zhukov, were preparing something far beyond urban defense, an operation that would not merely stop the Germans, but destroy them. As winter approached, the ruins of Stalingrad froze. Blood stained the snow. Bodies lay unburied. And still, the fighting continued. The battle was no longer about territory. It was about survival. And Stalingrad had no intention of surrendering. By late September 1942, Stalingrad was no longer a city in the conventional sense. It had become a shattered maze of ruins, smoke, and corpses. Streets had disappeared under mountains of debris. Buildings stood hollow, their walls torn open by artillery and bombs. Fires burned day and night, filling the air with ash and the smell of death. What remained was not a battlefield. It was a graveyard where two armies fought at point-blank range. The German strategy relied on speed, firepower, and intimidation. But in Stalingrad, those advantages began to collapse. Tanks could not maneuver through rubble. Air support lost effectiveness when front lines were only meters apart. Long-range artillery became dangerous to use. The city forced the Germans into close combat, where every room, staircase, and cellar became a killing zone. The Red Army understood this better than anyone. Soviet commanders abandoned traditional formations and embraced brutal urban warfare. Small assault groups replaced large units. Snipers, machine gun teams, and grenade throwers hid in ruins, waiting silently for German patrols to pass. Combat often erupted without warning, exploding into seconds of extreme violence before dissolving back into silence. Soldiers called it Rottenkrieg, rat war. Men lived like animals, crawling through sewers, hiding in basements, and fighting over piles of bricks. Control of a single building could change hands dozens of times in one day. A staircase might be held by Germans on the upper floor while Soviets occupied the lower levels. Sometimes enemies were separated by nothing more than a thin wall. One of the most infamous locations was the grain elevator. Isolated and heavily damaged, it was defended by a small group of Soviet soldiers against repeated German assaults. For days, the defenders fought with dwindling ammunition and food, using bayonets and grenades at close range. The Germans eventually captured the structure, but the cost was shocking. The building became a symbol of how fiercely the Soviets would resist, no matter the odds. Snipers turned the city into a nightmare. Among them was Vasily Zaitsev, whose deadly accuracy terrorized German soldiers. Every exposed movement became a risk. A helmet lifted above rubble could draw a fatal shot. The psychological pressure was immense. Men learned to move only at night, to avoid windows, and to fear silence as much as explosions. Meanwhile, civilian suffering reached unimaginable levels. Thousands of residents remained trapped in the ruins, hiding in cellars with no food, no water, and no medical care. Children watched their parents die. The wounded lay untreated. Entire families were buried alive under collapsed buildings. For them, Stalingrad was not a symbol or a strategy, it was a slow, merciless death. As October arrived, winter began to tighten its grip. Temperatures dropped, and rain turned rubble into freezing mud. German supply lines stretched dangerously thin. Ammunition and food became scarce. Soldiers wore summer uniforms in sub-zero cold. Frostbite claimed fingers, toes, and lives. Morale began to erode. Yet Hitler demanded victory at any cost. Orders were clear: Stalingrad must fall. Retreat was forbidden. The Sixth Army was instructed to press forward, no matter the losses. Each meter gained was celebrated, even as casualties mounted into the tens of thousands. For the Soviets, the defense of the city became sacred. Not one step back was more than a slogan, it was a death sentence for retreat. NKVD units enforced discipline, sometimes executing deserters on the spot. Fear, patriotism, and desperation fused into a relentless will to survive. As October arrived, winter began to tighten its grip. Temperatures dropped, and rain turned rubble into freezing mud. German supply lines stretched dangerously thin. Ammunition and food became scarce. Soldiers wore summer uniforms in sub-zero cold. Frostbite claimed fingers, toes, and lives. Morale began to erode. Yet Hitler demanded victory at any cost. Orders were clear: Stalingrad must fall. Retreat was forbidden. The Sixth Army was instructed to press forward, no matter the losses. Each meter gained was celebrated, even as casualties mounted into the tens of thousands. For the Soviets, the defense of the city became sacred. Not one step back was more than a slogan, it was a death sentence for retreat. NKVD units enforced discipline, sometimes executing deserters on the spot. Fear, patriotism, and desperation fused into a relentless will to survive. By November 1942, Stalingrad was no longer a city. It was a ruin layered upon ruins, pulverized stone, twisted steel, and frozen corpses embedded in the ground like relics of a lost civilization. Smoke still rose from the rubble, but now it mixed with snow. Winter was coming, and it would show no mercy. The German Sixth Army was still fighting block by block, believing victory was just days away. But what they did not see, or chose not to believe, was that the city had become a trap. And the jaws were beginning to close. While German forces were locked in brutal urban combat, Soviet high command had been preparing something far larger. Far away from the ruins of Stalingrad, entire armies were being repositioned in silence. Tanks were camouflaged. Bridges were reinforced. Rail lines worked day and night. This was not chaos. This was calculation. The plan was called Operation Uranus. On November 19, 1942, the storm broke. At dawn, Soviet artillery opened fire, not inside the city, but on the weaker Axis flanks guarding the German advance. At dawn, Soviet artillery opened fire, not inside the city, but on the weaker Axis flanks guarding the German advance. Romanian, Italian, and Hungarian units, poorly equipped and stretched thin, faced a barrage unlike anything they had experienced. Within hours, Soviet tank formation surged forward across the frozen steppe. The attack was overwhelming. German commanders at Stalingrad initially dismissed the reports. They believed the Red Army was exhausted. They believed the flanks would hold. They believed the Führer's assurances that the situation was under control. They were wrong. Within days, Soviet pincers closed behind the Sixth Army. The encirclement was complete. Over 300,000 Axis soldiers were trapped inside and around Stalingrad. The hunters had become the hunted. Inside the pocket, confusion turned to fear. Supply lines were severed. Ammunition dwindled. Fuel froze. Food became a memory. Wounded soldiers lay untreated in cellars turned into makeshift hospitals, their screams echoing through the ruins. Hitler ordered the army to hold its ground. No retreat. No breakout. He promised salvation from the skies, an airlift that would sustain the trapped army until relief arrived. Hermann Göring assured him it could be done. It could not. The Luftwaffe was incapable of supplying an army of that size in winter conditions, under constant Soviet fire. Planes crashed on frozen runways. Others were shot down before landing. What little reached the city was a fraction of what was needed. A soldier required roughly 3,000 calories per day. Many received less than 500. Hunger became a constant companion. Men began eating horse meat, then dogs, then rats. Bread was mixed with sawdust. Frostbite claimed fingers, toes, entire limbs. Weapons malfunctioned. Oil turned to sludge. Even the dead froze solid, impossible to bury. Morale collapsed. Letters home grew desperate, then incoherent, then stopped entirely. Meanwhile, the Soviets tightened the noose. They advanced methodically, crushing resistance sector by sector. Every German attempt to break out was repelled. Every relief effort failed. The ruins of Stalingrad became a killing ground. The Red Army had learned from its earlier defeats. Units rotated in and out. Snipers hunted officers. Artillery targeted supply drops. Night attacks kept the Germans awake, exhausted, paranoid. The psychological toll was immense. Soldiers began to hallucinate. Some surrendered voluntarily. Others clung to false hope, convinced that a miracle was coming. They had been told the Reich never abandoned its soldiers. Reality told a different story. The ruins of Stalingrad became a killing ground. The Red Army had learned from its earlier defeats. Units rotated in and out. Snipers hunted officers. Artillery targeted supply drops. Night attacks kept the Germans awake, exhausted, paranoid. The psychological toll was immense. Soldiers began to hallucinate. Some surrendered voluntarily. Others clung to false hope, convinced that a miracle was coming. They had been told the Reich never abandoned its soldiers. Reality told a different story. As December deepened, temperatures dropped below -30 degrees Celsius. Frostbite outpaced combat injuries. Entire units ceased to exist, not from battle, but from cold and starvation. General Friedrich Paulus, commander of the Sixth Army, sent repeated requests to withdraw. Each was denied. Hitler promoted him to Field Marshal, a symbolic gesture, loaded with meaning. No German field marshal had ever surrendered. The implication was clear. Death was expected. But even pride could not stop the inevitable. By January 1943, the Soviet advance split the encircled army in two. Resistance crumbled. Ammunition was nearly gone. Soldiers fought with captured weapons, or not at all. The once proud Sixth Army was now a starving mass of broken men hiding in ruins, waiting for an end they could no longer control. On January 31, 1943, Paulus surrendered the southern pocket. 2 days later, the northern pocket followed. The Battle of Stalingrad was over. But the cost was beyond comprehension. Over 2 million casualties, killed, wounded, captured, or missing. Entire divisions erased. A city annihilated. An army destroyed. For the first time in the war, an entire German field army had surrendered. The myth of invincibility was shattered. And the world understood something had changed. Stalingrad was no longer just a battle. It was a turning point in human history. Winter tightened its grip around Stalingrad like a vice. By January 1943, the city was no longer a battlefield. It was a frozen graveyard. Temperatures plunged below -30 degrees Celsius. Weapons jammed. Engines froze. Wounded men died where they lay, not from bullets, but from exposure. The German Sixth Army was surrounded, starving, and slowly collapsing. Inside the Kessel, the cauldron, discipline eroded day by day. Rations were reduced to a few hundred calories. Bread was mixed with sawdust. Horse meat vanished. Soldiers boiled belts, boots, and scraps of leather, desperate for any illusion of nourishment. Dysentery, frostbite, and typhus spread uncontrollably. The proud army that had marched across Europe was now reduced to shadows wrapped in rags. Despite the reality on the ground, orders from Berlin remained detached from truth. Adolf Hitler forbade retreat. Stalingrad was to be held at all costs. Supplies were promised by air, but the Luftwaffe could not deliver even a fraction of what was needed. Planes crashed, were shot down, or froze on the runways. Hope arrived from the sky, then disappeared just as quickly. General Friedrich Paulus understood the situation was hopeless. His officers urged a breakout attempt while it was still possible. But obedience to Hitler's command was absolute. The Sixth Army stayed where it was, bleeding itself dry for a city that no longer existed. On January 10, the Red Army launched Operation Ring, the final Soviet assault to crush the encirclement. Artillery thundered across the frozen steppe. Thousands of guns fired simultaneously, turning the ruins into a storm of steel. German positions collapsed one after another. Resistance became fragmented, localized, desperate. Soviet troops advanced block by block, bunker by bunker. The Germans fought on, often without ammunition, using knives, entrenching tools, even bare hands. But there was no strategic coherence left, only survival. Entire units surrendered en masse. Others fought to the last man, driven by fear, indoctrination, or sheer inability to accept defeat. On January 30, 1943, Hitler promoted Paulus to Field Marshal. The message was clear: no German field marshal had ever surrendered. Suicide was expected. Paulus did neither. 2 days later, on January 31, Soviet troops reached his headquarters in the ruins of the Univermag department store. Paulus surrendered the southern pocket of the Sixth Army. The northern pocket fell on February 2. The Battle of Stalingrad was over. Of the more than 300,000 Axis troops who entered the battle, only about 90,000 survived to surrender. Among them were 22 generals. They were marched into captivity, gaunt, frostbitten, hollow-eyed. Few would ever return home. By 1955, barely 6,000 German prisoners from Stalingrad were repatriated. The scale of destruction was unprecedented. Estimates vary, but total casualties, killed, wounded, missing, or captured, exceeded 2 million. Entire divisions were annihilated. The city itself was reduced to rubble, yet it had held. For the Soviet Union, Stalingrad became more than a victory. It was a symbol of survival, sacrifice, and defiance. The Red Army had not merely stopped the German advance, it had shattered the myth of Nazi invincibility. From this point forward, the strategic initiative on the Eastern Front shifted permanently. Across the world, the impact was immediate. Allies took heart. Axis partners faltered. In Germany, the defeat was officially framed as heroic resistance, but privately it was understood as catastrophe. Goebbels called for total war, acknowledging that the conflict had entered a new and far more desperate phase. Stalingrad marked the psychological turning point of World War II. The war would continue for more than 2 years, with even greater destruction yet to come. But the question was no longer if Nazi Germany would fall, only when. In the ruins along the Volga, amid frozen corpses and shattered steel, an empire had broken itself against a city that refused to die. Stalingrad was not just a battle. It was the moment history turned.